What's going on, guys? Braces here. Today we will be talking about Chaff, how to use it, and when to use it. So let's start with answering the simple question, which is what is Chaff? So in general, people perceive that Chaff are just the small units that interfere with your charges, that block your movement, and generally block your big blocks from advancing forward, which is partially true, but in my opinion, Chaff is just more than that. For me, Chaff, I at least call Chaff every expendable unit in my army, which in most cases is most of my army, because I don't like putting very expensive units in my armies. So in the picture you can see the most common use of Chaff. You position your models in a way that enemies cannot charge past them. And meanwhile, the overruns will not reach your other models. So basically, blocking the opponent from effectively doing anything. If they want to overrun, they will overrun to the flank, and they will get flank charged most likely next turn. So let's talk about some different kinds of Chaff. You can have very simple Chaff units, which are clearly Chaff, and they don't have much use except for that, which are, for example, Furies, Eagles, Yeoman Outriders, or Elaine Reavers. You can obviously find more and more examples of this. But the more interesting type of Chaff is multi-purpose Chaff, so the one that can do several things at once. It is often more expensive and much harder to use. Here belong things like Knights of the Sun Griffin, or Knights Aspirants, or Mounted Sirens, or Grotlings, or even Mounted Raids. So why are those things harder to use? Basically because they cost more. You want them to do something more than just Chaff. So at times you will find yourself wondering whether you should sacrifice them or not, which is obviously a question you should ask yourself every time, but hesitating to use the Chaff when needed because it can maybe play some other role is a mistake. And you should always bear in mind that the Chaff is mostly Chaff, and then all the other roles come. Knights of the Sun Griffin obviously are very nice because they are very resilient. They will kill most of the other small units, and they are scoring, but they are the slowest. And generally, units that will hit harder within the like 200 price range will be the slow Chaff. The one main advantage over those kind of units, so like Knights of the Sun Griffin, Aspirants, or just Imperial Cavalry, that the single purpose Chaff has, so like Furies or Mounted Sirens, is that the light troops. So basically you can cover much bigger area. It is very easy to just position your Mounted Sirens, for example, in a 5x1 formation, so only one column, but 5 ranks. So actually you have 10-inch line of Chaff that can very easily Chaff half of the opponent's army. And basically, if you just position the rest of your army just over 11 or 12 inches, depends how risky do you feel for the overruns, then you are perfectly safe, and the opponent is in quite of a pickle. So the important thing to know is when to Chaff. So we have two situations here. I will give you a second to think. Which one would you rather be in as a chaffing guy? So the first one is Bretonia is chaffing orcs. The second one, Dread Elves are chaffing vampire covenants. So obviously, I will be. I would rather play as Bretonia here, since my units are much closer to my enemy. They are ready to charge. And my enemy was, on the other hand, close enough that if he called the war, then he would be able to charge one of my units with ease. So it basically had to be stopped. Also, as you can see, the orcs have no way of overrunning, because if they overrun, they will get one of the realms, possibly both, into the flank. And in the second situation, we have a very weird chaff positioning. The harpies are chaffing the vampire units, but the vampire units that are being chaffed, so zombies and skeletons with court, both with vampire heroes on steeds in them, were not very likely to charge this turn either way. Especially because Lord on Pegasus didn't have to be put in this exact spot. He could have easily be put 1 or 2 inches more to the back, and then the charges would be really far. Now, the vampire player has very much of a free choice. He can either charge the court unit at the harpies and then just back off everything else. And it will be very hard for Dreadl's player to punish that, since most of his units are far outside the charge range. And the other option is obviously charging the zombies with the vampire into harpies, and charging one of the dogs into the peg lord. This is actually quite a huge mistake on the Dreadl's part, since the charges to the peg lord are not that far, because dogs are very fast, and with the champion on, vampires can pin the Dreadlord down in place for a turn, and in the next turn proceed to charge him when he's most powerless, as you can expect that the Dreadlord has the Midnight Cloak, so he's most powerful on the charge. With no charge, he is much worse. When to chaff. Another thing that I would like to add here is that I personally like to chaff very rarely. I try to keep my chaff units as long as possible, even if this means giving my opponent long charges, as long as obviously those long charges don't come for free. So every time you chaff your opponent, you have to ask yourself some simple questions. But the main one is, can you avoid chaffing your opponent now? Can you leave this unit for later? Can you just position yourself a bit better without much of a change in the positioning? So actually I had a very interesting game, one of the hardest games I've played for the last years, on this year's Polish Team Championship. I was playing against Undyne Dynasty's player. He had three big units that I had troubles handling, but even though he had those 3 units and he could push me easily, I managed to move around in such a way that I didn't need to use my chaff until turn 6, and even then on turn 6 I was still left with 1 unit of chaff. So remember that chaffing is not always necessary, and that I cannot stress this out enough. Always think whether you really need to chaff. Always. So here are some of my favorite chaff units from each of the books. I would like to point out to some of those. So from Demon Legions, mounted Sirens with Champion, with +1 to wound and a ridiculous amount of attacks. They are also really good monster hunters. With 5 upward they are pretty durable, even though only 6 up armor save. So and obviously the breath weapon support is excellent. Then you have Yeoman Outriders in Kingdom of Aquitaine, which are probably the cheapest fast cavalry chaff in the game. 125 points, and both in build, really amazing. And you have Rampadon Riders in Saurian Ancients. They are not as common nowadays, but I still think that the damage output that they can produce and the chaff possibilities in the army that doesn't really have that much good chaff make them excellent choice. Then Sylvan Elves, Druid on Horse. Also not a very common pick, though in some in many armies you can bring a very similar character for basically 170 points. If you have units to hide him behind, you get both the spell and the chaff when needed, and the challenge when needed. So you have 3 rolls in one, and the price is very low. And Dying Dynasties, 20 skeletons with Standard and Banner of the Entombed. So this is very weird chaff. And Dynasties obviously have very interesting chaff and very basic chaff as well. This is one of the most interesting in the game, in my opinion, because it is not that reliable, because it ambushes and free up. But on the other hand, those are 20 skeletons. They can always come near your main block to be a second mage bunker. They can always come on the scenarios, and they can, as I said, come out as chaff. With new rules for coming out, they are pretty. You can pretty much rely on that as long as you roll the free up. So, and vampires, 8 die rolls with champions, the bane of all dragons and Pegasi heroes. I think this is actually my favorite chaff. Very cheap, comes out of core. I will recommend them to everyone. So this was the video about chaff. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you in the next one. Cheers.